This type of xenophobia and nationalism is not only a problem in the United States, but it's now traveling around the world. And anti-Semitism is a gateway. It's almost like a gateway drug to these new forms of hatreds with an S, and of dehumanization and fragmentation. So as scholars, we need to really engage these issues. And I would say, in a sense, the study of anti-Semitism, as you will hear in the next few days from leading scholars from around the world, that it's the oldest hatred. And if you think about it, it starts perhaps thousands of years ago. It began when the colonial ships were going out to explore the New World. They were passing the Jewish people that were expelled and exiled and forcibly converted. So this is an old form of hatred that we need to understand.
Jews represent that freedom and equal rights for all mankind are God-given, and that the only superior entity is God. Moreover, Judaism teaches that because every human being is godly, we are all truly one nation called the Brotherhood of Mankind. In Judaism, mankind is one international brotherhood created in the image of God. Imagine a world that truly consisted of one nationhood comprising of numerous cultures. Imagine that we all understood that real brotherhood is built on each person's godly value. Would we not see each other as partners in constructing the world, as opposed to occasionally wreaking havoc and destruction? Would we not work to value each other and learn from one another, instead of dominate and even abuse each other? This is the message that the Jews are meant to bring to the world.
From my point, and from knowing, fighting with BDS and its leaders on many campuses for years, I'm sure that's anti-Semitism, because that's clear double standard. There is no attempt to connect to the demand boycott in connection with the behavior of China or Iran or any other country. But what we hear, they say that's exactly why we don't like this so-called definition of anti-Semitism. Because it doesn't matter whether it is double standard, it's not double standard. Israel should be boycotted. And I'll give you one scene of many which I met on American campuses, and I was in hundreds of them in the last 20 years. So in 2015, I'm coming to Brown University, and I have a lecture together with Michael Douglas about the importance of identity, and specifically about Jewish identity. And as always, when there is anything Jewish and anything connected to Israel, there is also demonstration of students. And before the lecture, I go out, there is a demonstration of students who are standing with the slogans, Israel is an apartheid state, boycott Israel. And I come to one young girl and I say, you're too young to remember really the world of apartheid. But I is the one who was friend of Nelson Mandela. And I is the one who was international observer of the first elections. The one who spent quite a time in Soweto and in some other places in South Africa. Let me talk to you for a few minutes and to tell you what was exactly apartheid in South Africa.
The policy of forgetting Babi Yar, and that's why I present it in this forum, was clearly underpinned by anti-Semitism. Stalin had harsh anti-Semitic policies, both persecuting Jewish cultural activists and dismantling all Jewish, all hitherto existing Jewish cultural institutions. Khrushchev was a more traditional, folksy, he had a peasant background, anti-Semite, who made a lot of inappropriate, we would say today, a lot of politically incorrect comments about Jews, their greediness. But also in the 60s, we see a time when there is a renewed attack against Jews, dismantling of synagogues, etc. So it's interesting, two things that we see here with Viktor Nekrasov. Then we will move to Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who was a more famous case. We see here non-Jews who care about Babi Yar, and also we see the rise for the first time ever of protest dissent or dissidence within the Soviet Union.
In March 1928, Hassan al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood in Cairo. This is their creed. Allah is our goal. The Prophet is our leader. The Quran is our law. You might think, okay, so far so good, but then jihad is our way. Jihad, of course, means killing. It means purifying. The Muslim Brotherhood was heavily influenced by Salafism, which is a purist movement. The jihadists are purists, as the Nazis were purists. Beware of people who want to purify humanity. And it's in many parts of the world, the contagion that humanity has to be purified of is Jews and Judaism.
And so where one finds anti-Semitism today is amongst younger people, and particularly where a swastika is painted, not on shop windows or at railroad stations or even at sports stadiums, but on university campuses, on Jewish fraternity houses, and on banners on campus demonstrations. And what's the situation in Europe? This survey that we did both in 2015 and 2018, we surveyed these several hundred Jewish leaders, community leaders, and they were asked who were their allies in the fight against anti-Semitism, almost, always, or most of the time. A majority, interestingly enough, 54%, said their national governments were supportive, while only 13% said intellectuals and academics acted as friends of the Jews. Conversely, when they were asked who they saw as a threat to Jewish communities, always or sometimes, 33% of the Jewish leaders in Western Europe cited Western European intellectuals and academics.
Some or most Arab states, Sunni, moderate, pro-Western, at least when it comes to the official regimes, do cooperate with Israel. And basically, this irritates all these erstwhile enemies of Israel, Turkey, Iran, Palestinians alike, who are trying actually to use that and use coronavirus as kind of an epidemic disease that show that normalization has, or some of them were infected by a Western sense called normalization, which is something that tears up the whole Middle East and the Arab world.
The fact that the Jews never had sovereignty, and the fact that the Jews were wandering around the world, that the idea of the wandering Jew always made them susceptible to charges of spreading the plague. From early on, from the time of Claudius, from the time of the Roman emperors, all the way, of course, to the Black Plague in 3048, 3049. Always the Jews were kind of like perceived and were defined by anti-Semites as worms, as those who are spreading plagues, as those who are making, poisoning rivers, whatever they want. All the anti-Semitic tales had something to do with this conspiratorial Jews who are basically delivering the plague. Not to say anything about the Nazis, for whom the Jews were always like worms. This was like the term which were used. There were those who had to be extinguished, had to be destroyed because they're spreading something.
Another book that is very problematic is the reprints of the Mein Kampf of Kifahi for Adolf Hitler. It is amazing how many reprints are there in modern times, and so you will tend to find these are different reprints for the book. So here, these are, if you in combating anti-Semitism, you have to work with the culture. You are fighting against all these odds, against all this literature that's being spread within the Arab world.
Al-Banna, in one of his statements, confirmed that, as he said, in one of it, as long as one Jew is fighting in Palestine, the mission of the Muslim Brotherhood will not end. As soon as the cooperation between the Husseini and the Brotherhood began, the Brotherhood began to wage horrific campaigns against the Jews to clarify their dangers to the Muslims and the Islamic nation or Islamic Ummah. This confirms that the Mufti's success in recruiting the Muslim Brotherhood for Hitler and the Nazis. On the other hand, Mufti helped the Banna to reach the prestigious social and political circles after he was a leader of the marginalized and lower classes.
One which you have never heard about and probably never will after this lecture hear about again is the Israeli refugee problem. In the course of the war, 70,000 Israelis, Jews, and then later they became Israelis after the state was declared, 70,000 Jews were displaced from their homes, from homes in kibbutzim, settlements, areas, urban areas, which were overrun by the Arab states' armies, or threatened with being overrun by Arab states' armies. 70,000 Jews became refugees. Now, you may think 70,000 is a very small number, but in Palestine at the time, there were 650,000 Jews. So in the course of the war. So 70,000 would have been 10% of Palestine's Jewish population were turned into refugees in the course of the war. Say in America, if a tenth of the population was displaced and turned into refugees, you'd have 30 million refugees, 30 million in America. So 70,000 for Israel was an enormous refugee problem. But it didn't last because Israel won the war. Most of the territory conquered by the Arab states in the initial stages of the war was reconquered by the Jews, and the people who'd been moved out of their settlements and urban neighborhoods essentially went back to where they'd come from. So no Israeli refugee problem resulted from the 1948 war. By the end of the war, there was no refugee problem among Israelis.
It's impossible. The Western culture is part and parcel of Iranian identity in the last 200 years. If you take these issues of constitutionalism, parliamentarism, new education, science, it's all borrowed from the West. So what we see in Iran is a country with different layers of identities. What happened in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution, that there was a dramatic change in Iran from a policy of westernizing, pro-American, friendly with Israel, loyalty to the monarchy, to an Islamic republic which is based on Islam or Islamism or radical Islam or different aspects of Islam, because there is no one Islam either. Of course there is one Islam. This is the Islam of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. But we don't live today with what was Islam in the 7th century.
Some of the press interviewed him and tried to find out whether he really thought that Hamas and Hezbollah were friends, movements to which anti-Semitism is very important. And he wiggled out of it, really, wriggled. He wriggled and he said, well, I'm for peace, and in peace you have to talk to your enemies. And I was using diplomatic language. I had these guys in the room and I called them friends, and you shouldn't make such a big thing out of it. But later on in the same speech, he had said this, quote, an organization, he was talking about both Hezbollah and Hamas, organizations dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people and bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region. So he articulated very clear support for these two movements. If I said to you that the Ku Klux Klan was dedicated towards the good of the American South, you would understand from that I supported the Ku Klux Klan, right? You'd understand from that I thought that this was a good movement.
We're actually allowing people, whether it's far right, whether it's far left, or whether it's Islamism, we're allowing recruiters to these ideologies the time that they require to actually radicalize people and make some of them operational. The interesting key fact is that amongst one or two other things, anti-Semitism is the fuel, the opium of the masses, as Mona El-Sahawi described it, is the fuel that drives all of these three distinct ideologies to recruitment to somebody potentially becoming violent.
So in America, Jews are often discussed as though they're not a real minority, They're just a little subset of the white majority. And that same description of Jews as white is then attached to Israel. Now, this is bizarre because almost half of Israel's Jews come from Asia, Africa, or the Balkans. And 2/3 of the world's Sephardic and Asian or African Jews live in Israel today. So the Jews in Israel are not white in the way that is usually discussed. And the reason why the non-whiteness of about half of Israel's Jews is often buried in these discussions is because it's much easier to portray Jews and Israel falsely as a colonial power if Israel is pictured as being a white country. So then Israel becomes a white colonial outpost of the United States.
Now we can actually understand their stupid language and figure out what they really mean by what they're saying. And that's really important. So here's an example of how we do that. What I'm showing you here is the word Jew, and we're zooming in on a galaxy of meaning. Our AI has become a member of a community that's extremely hostile called 4chan. And we've taken 100 million comments from 4chan, and we asked our AI to create a star map of meaning so that it can summarize what the word Jew means for us. And it makes a star chart, but instead of stars, we're looking at words. And instead of space, we're looking at meaning space. And so when we zoom in on the Jew galaxy here, what we see are solar systems of meaning that surround the conversation in relationship to each other in meaning space. So what's interesting is that the largest components and the closest components to the word Jew are ethnic disgust, right? Like, and here's all the code words that go with that: a Chaim, a Shlomo, a kike, a Jew fag, a Chosenite. Some of them I knew, some of them I didn't. And so the ones we don't know, we can discover their meanings because they show up in these clusters with our tools.
No sooner had I left the agency than my successors found ways to undermine it. They were concerned because they did not believe that Jews should be protected at all from anti-Semitism, either because they thought it was too broad an interpretation of the statute, or because they thought civil rights should be focused more on less privileged groups like African Americans or Hispanics or women. So that was the first challenge, and we overcame it finally 10 years ago when the Obama administration essentially ratified a guidance letter that I had written and established once again that OCR would address campus anti-Semitism. But the second and bigger problem was that OCR didn't understand what was anti-Semitism.
Concepts such as the potential of every human being, the limitless potential of every human being, and the fact that every human being was put on earth for a reason and to have a transformative effect on the world is an incredibly important concept. The idea of tikkun olam, that the world is imperfect and was created broken so that we in humanity can work to fix the world. Tikkun olam b'malchut Shaddai, the perfection of the world under the sovereignty of the Almighty. All of these are Jewish values that have shaped and transformed all of civilization. Now I ask, because we have representatives here from many countries around the world, can you tell the history of the United States in a deep, fundamental way without talking about Jewish contributions to that history?
And of course, we know that the most notable leader of the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Baptist minister, was deeply inspired by the Jewish prophets. Some of Dr. King's most well-recognized and famed speeches and sermons were inspired by the Jewish scriptures, the Jewish story of liberation. Hearkening back to Amos, let justice roll. This is an allusion to the Jewish prophet Amos. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech was deeply inspired by the prophet Isaiah, the hills being brought high and the valleys being brought low. This is an allusion to the Jewish scripture from Isaiah. And of course, Dr. King and Rabbi Abraham Heschel had a deep friendship and walked together in the civil rights movement. Many of the freedom riders, I would say probably a majority of the non-Black freedom riders who came from the North to march alongside African Americans in Mississippi, Alabama, and other places were Jewish.
Lyrics possibly imply Jewish people are exploited property owners and discriminatory financial planners. And these are stereotype lessons rooted in Nazi racial canons and archetypes, which is really amazing when you think of, not amazing, but it's kind of sad because the Jewish people were killed for not being white. And at the same time, the Black nationalists who speak about racial oppression side with neo-Nazis with this thinking. And one thing also that becomes clear is that these racial archetypes, they not only tease their way from just this control and monopoly, but you also get other stereotypes, particularly in the criminal justice system. Like according to Waka Flocka in a Hype remix, this was a song, Hype remix, he says, "I beat the case because my lawyer's Jewish." Or Nicki Minaj, her lyrical statement, check this out, 25 million to broker the deal, Jewish my lawyer, he kosher the deal. Celebrates archetypes and unfortunately reinforces racist notions about Jewish attorneys.
ISGAP has brought together students and leading thinkers from across the world to learn about anti-Semitism. At the end of the week, they are given the opportunity to present their curricula that they have been developing throughout the course.
I have an idea for a project. So it would be like a virtual museum. I originally had intended this to be this was a project that I did for a class, and the idea of doing like a real museum, but now with post-COVID world, everything being online, it actually kind of works out that it could be an online virtual museum. So it's kind of the importance of making these online resources available for students who are working at home, who are studying at home, educators who might not have the knowledge or the know-how to teach about these subjects. So this idea, it's a museum that uses the Holocaust, the history of the Holocaust, to teach about really important things that I think are important themes, and it's geared toward middle school, high school students. So specifically, I would use different countries to teach about different lessons.
I have this title, White Men, Black Men, Jew Men, Jewish Men. But when I was a little girl, I remember we had different jokes, white men, black men, Jew men. I do recall those jokes. And so my main goal is to find the kinship of racism and anti-Semitism in the United States. And I will actually do that in a humanities course with an honors component. So the humanities course will actually open it up to the general population, but the honors is actually specified for particular students on our campus.
I will teach a class that I titled Global Anti-Semitism, which will both be an upper division history class, but it will also serve as an undergraduate course that will be part of the core curriculum of my college, in particular, part on the deep dive on the tentatively titled course Race, Diversity, Power, and Justice. We are in the process of revising the core, and this is the designation that we chose for this deep dive course.
And I just want to reiterate, I was listening to these presentations and listening to you today, and at one level, it's really absurd that we have to deal with these issues, that Jewish people, African American people, women, sort of the fragmentation of society, the erosion of basic notions of citizenship and democratic values, that once again, we're kind of struggling to have a voice and we're struggling to deal with these issues. It's kind of, at one level, pathetic that, our parents, our grandparents had to deal with these issues. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where we're dealing with them again, or we continue to deal with them, but they're becoming more pronounced in many parts of the world. And I think because of this emergency, as Elie Wiesel said, he said this in 2003, that this is an emergency. And this is not, the study of anti-Semitism is not a parochial Jewish issue or an Israeli issue. As Elie Wiesel knew and taught and experienced, that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. And I think the same could be said for racism. Racism can't be contained to its victim. Once we destroy the rights of one group of people, inevitably it affects another group of people. So I think coming together especially in the United States, that it's so fragmented, and we had some, I think, wonderful conversations by leading scholars who are dealing with issues of anti-Semitism and racism. And I think finding so many bridges. I think when we watch the news or we listen to some of the leaders of some of the communities and some of the people in positions of political power and even academic power, that we perceive ourselves, or we're beginning to perceive ourselves as so fragmented. But once we start to communicate and once we start to learn together, we realize there's so many possibilities, there's so many bridges that bring us together in a common struggle for decency and democratic principles.